Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the closing session. We're going to be focusing on the way forward, structural innovation for sustainable development. But first of all, I'm very excited to be able to introduce our rapporteurs, who are going to be reporting back on the discussions that have taken place in IRENA's Innovation Week 2025, both for the Innovation and Infrastructure stream and the use of renewables for sustainable development stream. We've got a great discussion this afternoon. We're going to be hearing from Anna Ramres-Tovar, who'll be giving the youth speech. I think it should be a really fun afternoon. So with no further ado, I will introduce both our rapporteurs, James Walker, Team Lead Renewable Gases for IRENA, who'll be talking about innovation and infrastructure. He'll be followed by Anisie, an analyst with IRENA, who'll be talking about renewable solutions for sustainable development. James.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Felicia, for the introduction and for the energy and the order that you've brought to the proceedings over the last couple of days. We really appreciate it. So good afternoon, guests, colleagues, friends. I am really delighted to be here to try to summarise the discussions we've had in the last 3 days in the infrastructure track. We were asked on Tuesday morning in the high-level opening to bring a curious spirit to the week and to really try to keep an open mind and listen and learn. And I can say on behalf of the Blue Track that we've done that, and I'm really pleased to be able to say that. Also in the high-level opening session, we were reminded that innovation is crucially important to achieving our energy transition objectives. And I particularly liked the analogy that one of the speakers gave that described innovation as a compass for our sector, guiding us forward. As you will definitely know by now from the discussions that we've had at IRENA, we try to bring a systemic approach to innovation. So we're looking at novel solutions which cut across technology, policy, regulation, market design, business models, and system operation. And I think it's fair to say that in the infrastructure track, we really covered all of these themes. Many said in their contributions that innovation is not just a question of technology, it's about people. And with bringing that perspective, they've made my job easier because we're already in a systemic lens. In that spirit, we heard from many speakers who were bringing perspectives about new ways to involve a wider range of stakeholders in the development of policy and strategy frameworks and plans for the development and accelerated deployment of infrastructure across the energy system. Of course, we had a focus on power networks in many of those discussions, but given my focus is on gas, I'm also pleased to say we had some discussion on infrastructure for the renewable gases also, and we'll come on to that shortly. So I wanted to just bring another anecdote in, another angle that came up in the conversation before I move back to the more serious topics. So we are increasingly discussing the benefits that renewables can bring to energy systems as the energy transition progresses. In addition to decarbonisation, we're considering resilience and security. But we're also continuing to discuss the benefits for people and their communities when renewables are deployed in the right way. But the anecdote that I want to get to is the other communities that were referenced in a couple of the sessions. So we learned on Tuesday that the shade provided by solar PV panels deployed in a rural water-scarce region in China have contributed to the growth of grass, which is feeding sheep and enhancing the incomes of communities reliant on agriculture in the area. And that's an unexpected but welcome benefit, a co-benefit we could say. And yesterday we also heard, which caught me by surprise, that a renewably powered data centre is being developed in Frankfurt on a rectified brownfield former site of a chemical manufacturer plant with bees living on the roof. So I wasn't expecting that this week would bring me examples of where renewable energy systems are contributing to biodiversity, but I think that's quite a nice outcome or extra opportunity to be optimistic and to be hopeful about the future. Focusing back on the technological aspects and considering some of the more directly innovative solutions, we have been very clear from the beginning that digitalization is a focus for this week, and that continued through a number of targeted sessions. But we also heard about digitalization in, I think, every session in this track, either in terms of its application in the explicit senses or more passively or more indirectly. We heard on one of the days that there is no digital transition without energy, and there is no energy transition without digital solutions. And I think we've lived that maxim through the week. So overall, on the Digitalisation Day, over 3 sessions, we heard about a wide range of use cases of digital solutions and their benefits for energy systems with high shares of variable renewable energies. We heard about digital and AI-driven solutions for forecasting expected renewable generation, and we heard about digital twin models for anticipating maintenance across generators and networks. Other speakers shared insights about control systems underpinned by AI, which are enabling operators to prevent the curtailment of renewable generators, or to finally facilitate the needed flexible demand-side response, which I think we can all say we've been discussing for many, many years now, but it's great to hear some of these solutions are meaning it's actually happening. These case studies of AI adoption give us reasons for optimism about what these new tools can offer our sector. But we heard about some of the considerations and challenges that we need to consider as AI tools and data centers which underpin them are developed. And we heard, of course, that power demand from data centers will grow rapidly in the coming years. What I found interesting was that there was limited agreement between the speakers on the panel about exactly when and how that evolution will occur and what shape it will take. But it was clear that the uncertainty that sits underneath that situation means that planning to address the requirement there is challenging, and that will require innovation in and of itself. However, one of the panelists suggested this was actually an opportunity in and of itself. So this is a quote from the panelist. Data centers are accelerating the recognition from regulators and asset owners of the need to scale up power system infrastructure and inputs. And this is a good thing. But there may be a tipping point. So mindful of that tipping point, it makes sense now to reflect back on the discussion we had on the first day. I'm jumping around a little. On the first day, we discussed infrastructure gaps in the power system and the need to join the dots, as we said, between generation and demand on the system. In that session, we enjoyed an enlightening crash course in power systems engineering. I think it really brought some technicality to the discussions. And we had a poll on the Slido where the people in the room here suggested that grid expansion was the highest priority to address constraints. The panel were not necessarily entirely aligned with that view. So the conversation focused then on non-wire solutions and digital and AI-driven opportunities to address capacity constraints on networks. One of the approaches that was highlighted was vector or system coupling. Believe it or not, it was a power system section, and we did talk about hydrogen. And there was a recognition from the panel that hydrogen and derivative commodities have a role to play at the edge of our increasingly renewable power systems. This gives me a very nice link to bring in the discussion themes that we tackled today here in this room. So in the first session this morning, we discussed the emergence of international markets for green commodities. That's including renewable hydrogen, ammonia and methanol, and the measures that are required to enable trade in technologies, systems, and the services that will underpin these sectors. We discussed a virtuous cycle between international market opportunities and the energy transition. So through the energy transition, we will see evolving trade patterns away from conventional fossil fuel dynamics. However, or meanwhile, the emergence of opportunities for trade in these commodities will also help to support further and faster deployment of renewable generators, production facilities for these commodities, and the underpinning infrastructure. We then moved into a session where we discussed various kinds of infrastructure required to deploy alternative and sustainable fuels in the heavy-duty transport sectors, focusing on shipping and aviation. And among other themes, the panel there discussed different visions for adopting novel and sustainable fuels in the two sectors. Innovation and regulatory frameworks was discussed as a potential enabler for further infrastructure deployment. And then, here we are. We arrived in the closing session. So, in the last few days, towards the end of the day, when we're all tired and ready to go home and leave for somewhere cooler, I've been cornering my colleagues and asking them to give me a couple of words to summarize their take on the day at the time. And many of them have reflected on synergies that were sitting between the speakers' perspectives, between different sectors, between different geographical angles on these problems, and in the space between the digital solutions that were being discussed, and felt that was a strength of the discussions. These colleagues also noted a clear theme that cut across many of the discussions, that there will be no one-size-fits-all solution to the challenges we face in digitalising the energy system and indeed in the development of infrastructure. Instead, we heard about a really broad range of tools and approaches and options which will apply differently in different geographies. I personally think we can go a bit further and describe the last couple of days in one word, and that's warm. The sun was shining, temperature's been rising, we've been hiding in this room where there's a bit of aircon, but I wanted also to take a moment to appreciate and acknowledge the atmosphere that we've cultivated amongst ourselves. So we've enjoyed really sincere knowledge exchange. The enthusiasm in the conversations that we've all been part of has been great, and I really hope that you've all learned as much as I have. So I'm going off script a little, looking for Felicia to be a bit nervous. I want to take my last 30 seconds on the stage just to say some thank yous. So the list of people who have made this all possible is too long. I would run out of Arina's time also. But I want to say a really sincere thank you to the core organising team across IRENA, who've invested an incredible amount of time making today possible. Thank you to all the partner organisations for shaping the sessions and contributing insights to further enhance the quality of the dialogue. Thank you to the extensive team that have kept the lights on, kept the screens when Slido working, kept the photos and the videos coming in, and the summaries and the live blogs rolling. The note-taking team have been working especially hard, I have to say, and that's been very much appreciated in preparing this. So lastly, thank you everyone who has taken a seat on the stage or joined us in conversations alongside, just for bringing your enthusiasm, your curiosity, your excitement, and as I say, I think that's really what's made this event such a great success. So thank you all very much, and over to you, Arina. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, James and Felicia. James, you set the bar very high. I don't know. I have a lot of notes here to report back and not so much off script and not so many jokes. But I'll do my best because we had amazing sessions going. I'm honored to report back for the green track, so-called renewable-based solution for sustainable development. We actually specifically designed this track to inform our upcoming innovation flagship report of IRENA, which is called Innovation Landscape for Sustainable Growth, powered by Renewable, which we aim to publish later this year. So thank you all very much for the very rich discussions that happened in the other track, and then that will be great food for thought and inputs on our report. We had indeed very rich discussion, mainly given by the amazing speakers we had. We had a very big diversity of speakers from public sector, private sectors, innovators, academia, civil societies, banks. But not only that, they also bring experience and stories from all over the world. We heard many stories from experts from Africa, either from regional institutions or national experts like countries from Tanzania, South Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, just to name a few. Also stories from Latin America, like Colombia in particular, and also large representation of countries from Asia. We heard stories from China, Japan, India, Malaysia, the Philippines. So really, really a very rich and global discussion happened also in the green track. I will go a little bit to, it was difficult to summarize what happened there. I will not try to make justice, really. We will also have recordings and we will have a summary report and you can refer back, but just few ideas and a little taste of the discussions. We started with a session on grid modernization, and we discussed about the unique challenges of grids in Global South, particularly due to massive new demand that requires massive grid expansion. And the demand is growing so fast that the reinforcing the grid, it's always needed, basically. Even if they reinforce it, the demand is already higher. In Africa, we learned that even those that have access, 40% still don't have reliable access, often due to issues of the grid. And the most significant challenges for grid modernization in these countries is the lack of investment, the lack of right policy regulation, and the aging infrastructure. There are some solutions, and of course we talked a lot about the innovations to overcome this, and planning can support allocation of resources for grid modernization, and ensuring a socially just distribution of the cost of the grid modernization is critical. We discussed about also innovations in digital technology that can support proactive operations. We heard from Tata Powers that it's using AI actually to determine the nature of the faults in the grid. We've heard that batteries are actually a valuable addition in Iceland grids like Palau, and renewable mini-grids seen as the main innovation to expand and enhance access in isolated areas, like in Palau or in South Africa. So grid modernization is not only about technology access, but also about social justice and not leaving anyone behind. This was a great highlight. And this brings me to the next session, where we transition from the top-down approach to the bottom-up solutions, and we explored the concept of energy communities and how they can deliver on the shared benefits that are essential in advancing the energy transition. So we heard in this session from innovators working on the ground that in tackling energy access, after years of deploying off-grid solutions, now we should know that the critical success factor is community, their engagement, their participation, and their endorsement. We must innovate not only in technology, not only in business models, but also in terms of engagement. This probably will reshape also a little bit our systemic innovation approach, because it also goes beyond that to social factors. And renewables are actually the most compatible with community energy approaches, as they provide opportunities to localize the generation infrastructure. How to enable energy communities? First of all, it was a really nice thread in the panel about narrative change and how important it is for community to buy in, to change the narrative from a climate change to development and local benefits, including those of the woman. Also to change the narrative in terms of goal. They're not simply to deliver energy, but reaching the development goals defined by the local community. In this way, energy becomes the platform through which communities can achieve their development goals. So, setting the right narrative guides policy, and setting the right policy guides funding. That was a very, very important key message. Then we also discussed the possibility of these communities being connected to the main grid, and how can actually provide more resiliency and also provide electricity to the main grid, and improve the business case for the expansion of the transmission grid to areas without access. The last message here I want to say, it's tying the expansion of electricity access and community energy projects to productive uses, and with the development of local industry in parallel, can be critical to success of the project. So it's, again, about local value. If the community starts using the energy project for economic development, all other elements fall into place. If not, the project falls apart, one of the panelists said. This takes us further to the productive uses of energy session that happened yesterday. In many countries, this is actually a challenge, because policy are still only looking at providing minimum levels of electricity or energy access without really planning for more productive uses. And ministries of energy also often think only in terms of large projects, but not so small projects. So a big topic of the discussion was financing. Financing energy projects for productive uses in the last mile, it's very difficult due to limited appetite for debt to fund smaller businesses. So availability of slower patient capital, more equity rather than debt would be beneficial for the sector, given the long-term nature of the local economic development. Then we talk about the fact that boring is good, because boring means investors and companies come in, so let's make productive uses boring. It was one of the messages. However, the panel does see that the market for implementation of productive uses of energy projects is taking off. So a call to action was to try to incentivize reliability over just lowering costs. And now we are actually witnessing a new phase for the energy access sector in which we have to talk to each other and to talk to other sectors like agricultures and waters. And let's not hope that the companies will save the world. It was another very interesting quote. In many value chains, it is women who are running the business, so coupling productive uses with women empowerment is particularly impactful. Then we linked the productive uses, and we discussed in the session yesterday, in the second session, about creating local value, supply chains, and skills. This was a very interesting session and a little bit disruptive, because we started with a very nice, we started with a question, which was, what is one word that comes to mind when you think of innovation, local value, supply chains, and skills in renewable energy? And the first word that appeared in the middle of the cloud was AI, as the first word that came to mind of this question. And towards the end of the panel discussion, the word changed to decolonize. So I will explain you what happened in the session, having this in mind. But basically, the idea was the energy transition doesn't just to be about gigawatt. It needs to be also about value creation, job creation, and localization of value chains. This can accelerate industrialization, can strengthen domestic industries, and build resiliency against global shock. Currently, most of the jobs are concentrated in a handful of countries. We also talk about the situation in Africa, which imports a lot of PV modules and a lot of lithium-ion batteries, even though the raw materials of these products are locally present, and the labor, it's also there as the youngest laborers on the planet. So we conclude that an interesting innovation and solution for this is regional joint industrial policies. So we discussed about the collaboration as being the key to leverage shared resources and building sustainable homegrown solution to the renewable energy sector across the global south. Partnering by developing countries as a bloc could provide the leverage to attract technology and infrastructure, and could offer privileged access to the large emerging markets. Then it was also a discussion about the change of the colonial roles that global south countries are still locked in many ways today, and this is like a regional joint industry policy. It's a way also to tackle that. Probably we will hear more about this, so I will not tell you much more. Maybe, yeah, one more reason. Regarding local development, we also heard from the panelists the example of fertilizers. Small renewable-based production centers can actually provide more resiliency supply and local value than relying on large-scale production from the global market. So we talked really a lot about how to overcome the challenges of creating local industries, but also how much more beneficial for the economy and for the local development. Okay, I am almost there. Finance was an important element yesterday that I want to mention very briefly. There was a quote: before we blend the finance or de-risk the finance, we should think about the structure in which the finance is providing and received in developing countries. So very complex and interesting ideas that took us from the innovation in AI to innovation in structural shifts. That is also the topic of today's panel. That brings us to the last day. This morning we had two amazing sessions also happening in the green track on bioenergy and innovative business models in Global South. We learned that to reach 1.5 target bioenergy, it's actually a must. 30% of the world energy is used in agri-food systems, and 30% of the global emission come from there. We learned the Brazilian case, the Indian case, the many cases in Africa. And again, we came also to weaving the discussion of local supply chains in end-use technologies to upgrade the assets of small local producers and businesses also in bioenergy. So it's kind of everything interconnected. We weave the same thread of narrative and localization. Just not to take too much time for the exciting session we have today, let me go to the last session that we had. It was on project facilitation in fragile countries, where we had excellent panelists talking about how to build renewable projects in conflict areas with political risk. There was a discussion that risk in such situations are such dynamic and not uniform access countries and region. So it requires to be on the ground presence. So there is a really disconnect between the perceived risk and the real risk in these countries. But also an expert from Africa said that perception of risk is often exaggerated in African context. So we have two different views. I've heard an interesting story from Ukraine, who was able to actually increase the renewable capacity by 2 gigawatts since the start of the war. So this is impressive, and it's thanks to the involvement of international organizations and financing partners that could help increase confidence in these investments. I will stop with the last message saying, from this session, saying that conflict-sensitive design includes peace building and the colonial elements in the project design itself. So investing in fragile settings is possible, it just takes the right mindset. All in all, I want to thank all the panelists and all the participants, because also we received a lot of questions from the audience, and it has been really engaging discussions over the past 3 days. And with no further ado, I will give the stage to Felicia. Thank you.
Thank you, Arina, and thank you, James. I think that was a fantastic summation of the conversations, and it's really positive and powerful messages. On that note, as I said, the panel discussion this afternoon is structural change and innovation for sustainable development. So to set the scene, could I welcome to the stage Diala Hawila, who's the Program Officer Policy Advice for IRENA.
Thank you, Felicia, and thank you, Arina, and the whole team for organizing this conference. Not only is it very well organized and it encourages us to think, to exchange, and you have mostly encouraged us to question things. So to sum up a conference on questioning, we're going to close with a session that will leave you with more questions than answers. So this is a session that is about what is needed in order to advance this energy transition and to do it in a way that benefits everybody equally. I have been in IRENA for more than 10 years. I'm not going to disclose how many exactly. And I have been seeing the same discussions over and over again. So I started asking questions, and I will share with you now my questions, and I am hoping that we have gathered a very excellent panel today, and they're going to say things that are a bit provocative, things that will lead us to question, and I am hoping that we will all leave with an open mind to consider the things that we're going to discuss later on and to take them with us in the way that we support the energy transition. So to set the scene of the discussion, you know, in IRENA, we collect a lot of data. So I will use some of the data to tell a story. It's not a very positive story. I mean, there is a lot of positive in it, but there's always a but. So I will focus on the but, and then I will hope that in the panel later on, we will find ways to answer those questions. So the data that I will use is investment data, investments in the energy transition in general and in renewable energy in particular. So we have been tracking this data for a long time now. Every 2 years we publish a report, the Global Landscape of Renewable Energy Finance. And for a while now, we have been focusing on reporting the data that tells a specific story that we are now trying to shift towards the structural change that is needed. So if we look at the global investment numbers, it tells a positive story. Investments globally are increasing. In this slide, the but is that it is concentrated in a few technologies. All the investments go to solar PV, to onshore, maybe a bit of offshore wind. But then there's other technologies that are probably not that attractive to private investors, that are not getting the attention that is needed in order to kick off the energy transition. And the other story is the concentration of investments in a few regions and countries. As you can see here, the advanced economies take most of the investments, and then we have China. And then we have the rest of the developing world. So we have separated what we are calling now major economies. Maybe we will change it, which you can find on the bottom. So these are the blue. This is the blue line from the red zone, which is the rest of the world. So this is the renewable energy investments. But if you look on the right side, with the text, this is about energy transition investments. So energy transition includes more than renewable energy. It also includes energy efficiency, electric vehicles, heat pumps, etc. So you see that in 150 countries where more than half of the world's population is living, we get only 10% of the global investments. So this tells a story. And if we look at Africa in particular, it receives 1% of those investments. The 2% is when we talk about renewable energy, and the 1% is when we go broader and talk about the energy transition. So we are seeing an increasing concentration of these investments. So this slide here shows the per capita investments, and it shows you how we have come to 2023, starting from 10 years ago, where the per capita investments in China and advanced economies are increasing at a very fast rate, which tells a very positive story for these regions. But then again, we see in the developing world, and specifically in the developing world minus the major economies, how things have not advanced. So then it gets us to question what is happening, because as we said yesterday in the discussion in the session on local supply chains are very focused, and even investments in supply chains are very focused. So if we look at investments in solar PV supply chains, 88% of the investments go to China. Another 2% goes to US, 2% to Europe. Southeast Asia gets 4%, India 1%, and then the rest of the world gets only 3% of investments in supply chains, which means that all the benefits of the supply chains are focused on a few countries. And this is a slide that I borrowed from the jobs report last year that shows the jobs in solar PV. 65% are focused in China, 86% are in only 10 countries, including China. So this shows you clearly how the rest of the world is not benefiting from the energy transition. And there's a lot of lost opportunities. I have 2 more minutes, and this is the most interesting part. So initially, we used to look at investments by public and private. But then the question is, why are those investments going to the developing world? And the answer we always see is the high risks. And the solution is always policies to mitigate the risk. So what we are now stuck in is a paradigm where renewable energy is a profit-making sector, and investors expect to get the return on investments, most probably in hard currency, and the public money, which is public goods, is there to only cushion their investments and to ensure that they take their money back with a high rate of return, because the higher the risk, the higher the cost of capital, and the higher they expect back, which is taking us to a place where the lowest income people pay the most for energy. That is a very basic necessity for development. So what we are doing in this year's report that we are going to present at the Financing Development Conference, hopefully it will get some traction, we are showing the numbers by profit-driven investments and impact-driven investments. The way we make the difference is through the rate of return that is expected. And when it's an impact-driven investment, it's a concessional loan or a grant. And when it's profit-driven, it's market rates and above. And an impact-driven investment can be simply what we are going to hear, for example, the case of Pakistan, where the system was not providing adequate access and people had to invest in solar PV, same as my country in Lebanon. It can be a community. It can be a community that wants to power a health center or a school. So impact-driven is anything that is driven by something other than profit. And this is how we would like to look at risks. When we talk about risk mitigation, we shouldn't just focus on the risk of investors not getting their money back. We should look at the risk of falling behind on so many sustainable development goals. How about the risk of leaving people behind? How about the risks of course, not meeting climate goals? And more risks that we are going to talk about in this session. So this is just to show you that when we talk about profit-driven investments, you see that the public sector is playing a bigger role in profit-driven. So the lines are being blurred between public and private, between impact-driven and profit-driven. So we are seeing private players like philanthropies going after impact, but we are also seeing public funds, such as climate funds, such as MDBs. So the word development and multilateral development fund and the word donor gets us to expect that this is going to be an impact-driven investment, but we see more and more that these are profit-driven investments. So these are some of the things that we need to start questioning, to start thinking, how can we do things differently? One of the things is we need a parallel narrative for how to finance renewable energy. Of course, the private sector-led and bankability and mitigating risk does work. It has worked. We've seen it is driving investments, but not everywhere. So how about a parallel narrative that is more inclusive? How about we stop looking at renewables from financing projects perspective and start looking at it from a system perspective, bringing in the finance people, the industrial people, the education and skills more into creating a whole system that can be more sustainable. So I will leave you now with all these questions, and I would hand back to Felicia to invite the panelists. So thank you very much. I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Dalia, for a very impassioned call for change. What we're hoping to discuss this afternoon is what is it we need to change and how are we going to go about changing it. So could I invite the speakers to come up to the stage, sorry, the panelists to come up to the stage, and could we have everyone sitting underneath their picture, because I think that makes it nice. Fadel Kaboub is an associate professor at Denison University and the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He specializes in public policy for economic sovereignty and sustainable development in the Global South. We have Jacob Mulugeta, who's Professor of Energy and Development Policy at the University College London and Climate Compatible Growth. He's involved with the UK government in that programme, and that supports sustainable energy and transport investments aligned with development. Beatrice Coda is the head of unit of the Clean Energy Transition Unit for the Directorate General for Research and Innovation at the European Commission. She's got very broad experience in the energy sector, from R&D to renewables deployment. We're also welcoming Pedro Ferraz da Silva, the Coordinator of Scientific and Technological Affairs in the Climate Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. He's a career diplomat who's coordinated scientific and technological affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Climate Department and actually represents Brazil in a number of international climate and technology forums. And finally, we have Zishan Ashfaq, who's the Chief Executive of Renewables First, a think tank advancing Pakistan's energy transition. And he works at the intersection of policy and climate action. With over a decade of experience, he's pioneered a number of initiatives, including the country's first 280 megawatt wind solar battery hybrid project. Now, before we start, I'm just going to mention that we have some of these reports, which Beatrice brought along with her, on Africa-EU collaboration and the work that the EU is doing. Now, we know there's huge opportunity in the energy transition. What we really want to understand is what's going wrong. So I'm going to ask my first question, which is really simple, and I'll direct it to Fadel first, but why is investment flowing mostly to the global north, with those people who need it most being left out?
Thank you for the question, and really thank you to the IRENA team for setting the scene with the latest data. That is more shocking than the previous data we had in our report from a couple of years ago. The number was 2% going to Africa, now it's 1%. So I think because we're really aiming to go really to be very frank and candid so that we know what the real challenges are, I'm going to bring the elephant in the room and put it on the stage. Okay. The huge renewable energy potential that we have in Africa and the rest of the global south, we perceive it as a huge opportunity, as a win-win on the climate front, on the development front. But this puzzle, this contradiction for the continent that has all the strategic minerals for unleashing this potential, all the renewable energy potential, is not able to attract any of the financing to unleash this potential, any of the financing especially to manufacture and deploy the renewable energy infrastructure, not to import the infrastructure manufactured somewhere else. This potential that we see is unfortunately perceived by other major economic blocs as a threat, right? Because the world is seen as a permanent hierarchy, that if you unleash the potential of development and industrialization for Africa to become an energy powerhouse for itself, that is, Africa escapes the bottom of the hierarchy, and somebody else will drop at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that is a false perception. And what we need to think of is a win-win scenario in which we move away from these colonial hierarchies and into a truly multipolar world in which the global majority, that is Africa and the rest of the global south, is at the center of a new international economic order, at the center of a truly multipolar world of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity. But that transformation requires understanding what are the structural transformations that need to happen to unlock the lock-in position that Africa is in. And I can summarize it in 3 basic points so they can set the scene for the conversation. And that is the colonial role, economic role that was imposed on the continent and the rest of the global south to be, number 1, the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that role. That needs to change. Number 2, to be the consumers of industrial output and technologies, including renewables technology, from the industrialized world. We still play that role, and that needs to change if we're going to unleash this potential. And number 3, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development and cooperation and trade and all of that. But effectively, it's designed to lock you permanently at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that needs to change. So changing that, meaning real industrial development, not just assembly line manufacturing. And the biggest potential for Africa in particular is in renewable energy infrastructure manufacturing that requires transfer of technology, sharing of technology that is available everywhere in the global north, but has been withheld. That requires investments in clean cooking infrastructure, investments in clean transportation infrastructure. Again, the transfer of technology, the sharing of technology, as in win-win joint venture, right? This is not charity. That's unleashing the potential, and that creates the possibility of a truly multipolar world. And that is really where the red lines are in a lot of multilateral space negotiations, is this transfer of technology, this unleashing this potential is perceived as unacceptable.
Now, let's unpick that a bit, because I don't think there's much of an argument about that conceptually, but part of what's happened in a lot of negotiations is an attempt to work through these issues, find ways of doing it. So, Jakob, can I bring you in on this? What are because we know what the structural problems are. What we're challenged with is how do we actually make change?
Well, thank you again for this invitation, and also, Diala, for a wonderful setting the scene. I think the figures that you showed us were quite. We knew them, but the updating of that is quite startling. I mean, I think what one can say is, of course, there is a systemic challenge that we are facing. On the one hand, you have, I mean, on the way over here, I was reading an article by some colleagues, Jason Hickel and Sullivan. And the paper is entitled, "How Much Growth Required to Achieve Good Lives for All?" And one of the things that this paper actually highlights is something like 95% of the population across the world is denied decent living standards, so they had minimum decent living standards. So what we have there is very much an inequality which is very much inscribed into the global economic relations already. Yeah. But then the other side of this paper was also it's offering an interesting segue in terms of offering solutions. And so their analysis were showing that with 30% of current global resource and energy use, it is possible to achieve the decent living standards for all. So that's the choice that we have. The choice we have is where we are now, where the 1% are responsible for something like 20% of global emissions and, of course, the energy that comes with it. And then the top 10%, you take it, up to 60%. And then the rest of the world. And here we're not just talking about global south, we're talking about poor people across the global north as well. So that's the choice that we have in terms of the types of policies that would lead us either towards a world where decent living standards are achieved or the continuation of the existing system. And of course, what then this means is that because the theme today is about structural change. So we are looking at a diversity of structural change that needs to be happening. But I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
No, it's really interesting to me. But again, what I'm really interested in hearing about is suggestions for the changes that we need to see. Because we've been trying to tackle poverty for decades, and we haven't got very far. Mm. We have a disconnect between power and between what we want to see happen in the world. But you have to work within, perhaps I shouldn't say this. I was going to say we have to work within the system we have. Mm-hmm. That is obviously open to discussion. But this is one of the challenges. There are a lot of people who want to see change in the world, but don't see where they can make that change happen. So what are the sorts of policies, because we talk about policies that will enable us to do that, but what do they look like?
I can quickly...
Sorry, can I just say, if anyone has anything to say, do put your hands up and jump in, because I think this is something open for everybody.
You go ahead.
So I'm going to bring that elephant again to answer this question. Let's take the SDGs, for example, right? Brilliant idea, right? We have all of these noble goals to achieve, by 2030, but we're failing, right? Because we're operating the system you're talking about, the global economic architecture. There's financial architecture, World Bank and IMF, international trade and investment architecture, that's the WTO, the international taxation architecture, which for the longest time was in the hands of the OECD. All of that architecture is by design a colonial architecture that was designed for colonial purposes. And if I can very quickly remind us of what colonialism was supposed to do, it was not designed for development. It was not designed for democracy or justice or SDGs. It was extractive, hierarchical, abusive, violent, right? And it still produces the same results. So if you want to achieve any of the SDGs, you can't rely on the existing architecture, economic architecture, that was never meant to produce development or a just transition or end poverty or hunger. It was supposed to extract. And I'll give you one number from the financial architecture, which is the latest data point we have, is $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. This is the financial architecture is designed to suck wealth, right? Extract wealth. If you look at the work that Jason Hickel and other colleagues that include all kinds of other components, it's trillions of dollars worth of extraction. So how are we going to end poverty or hunger or achieve the just transition? Compare those numbers, the trillions that are being sucked out of the global south, with all the climate finance numbers that we see from COP. The $100 billion promised from a decade ago, or the $300 billion, mostly private finance, extractive finance, or the loss and damage fund, which is barely 700 million, 800 million. It's not going to put a dent in any of this. So no wonder we're not achieving the SDGs. They're not achievable under this architecture.
But I think there's a real challenge here between the idea that we have a framework that we have a problem with. There is a structural problem, but we actually have specific things that we need to do. We need to see the rollout of renewable energy. We need to see poverty being addressed. You know, how can we set aside for a moment the conceptual discussion? And actually, can you give me some suggestions on how countries in the global south could actually go about getting built renewable energy infrastructure and creating jobs?
Yeah. Should I answer? Or?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I'll be very quick. I mean, there are examples, of course, for bringing in renewables at speed. And two interesting examples for me are, one is Costa Rica and the other one is Uruguay. And I think Colombia is also another interesting one that has come up recently. So quite a lot of the good examples in terms of addressing multiple benefits of well-being as well as economic growth is there. But there was a process that it involved. So for instance, the Uruguayan case is the one that, first of all, the problem identification happened domestically. And the actual work was done domestically. The modeling work, the kind of the planning, long-term planning and so forth, within their own national institutions. So the knowledge itself was within Uruguay. But then the other thing that they did was that as this idea of a long-term crisis management energy plan came out, what they needed to do was actually convince the rest of the political class to be able to buy into this. So they were able to create, with patience, the type of consensus that it needed, political consensus within. And Costa Rica's example is quite similar as well. But the difference there is, of course, these are countries with robust institutions and able to attract, the type of investment. So in the Costa Rican case, a lot of the investment came through public funds. In the Uruguayan case, a proportion of it came through public institutions, but also managed to attract some private sector investment. And what we've seen in the last 15, 20 years, particularly in Uruguay, is a scaling up of renewable energy implementation within the country. But the key for that was strong public institutions, and that's something that you can ride on. I think, relying entirely on the private sector to be able to do that is not going to work, and that's why a lot is failing in Africa. Because the first thing is that, risk perception is high. I don't believe that it's a risk perception in my understanding. I think, what you have here is a denial of certain, the risk perception is manufactured by the architecture that we have in place already. Thank you.
I think there is a really interesting point in there about the use of risk mitigation techniques to accelerate funding, because it does put the focus on your definition of risk. But I do think, I want to bring Zishan into this conversation, because obviously, we've heard a lot about the solar rollout in Pakistan. It's been enormous and rapid. What sort of lessons can we learn from that?
Thank you, Felicia. Before addressing this question, I would first like to address the first two questions that you raised. Policies, they don't always deliver. And that's what we saw in Pakistan. The first policy for renewable energy development was announced back in 2006. And under that, we were only able to install like 2.6 gigawatt of renewable energy projects in 2 decades. And then another policy was announced in 2019, and so far not a single project has been initiated under that policy. And for the last 2 years, the government struggled to attract a single investor for a 600 megawatt solar project because the country risk was way too high. And in the parallel world, what was happening was truly, amazing. The solar rush in Pakistan represents a remarkable and unexpected shift in the traditional energy transition initiative, particularly if seen from the perspective of the global south, because historically energy transition in those regions was seen as a top-down process steered by government policy initiatives, financed by international investments and supported by multilateral development banks. But what has happened in Pakistan has completely changed this narrative in a sense that, what we are witnessing in Pakistan is setting a rare precedent, because this rapid solar adoption is bottom-up, people-led and market-driven. In less than 3 years, we have been able to put up 20 gigawatt of solar panels, and that is almost half of the total, installed capacity in our electricity system. And the drivers for, this rapid adoption are really compelling, because the electricity prices were going through the roof. Grid, though it had surplus electricity, it was still struggling with reliability, and solar panel costs were going down, rapidly, and that was a perfect recipe for this mass-scale adoption of, solar rooftop revolution, as we call it in Pakistan, and it is shaped by the households whose electricity bills were, more than their monthly rents. Businesses were struggling to remain competitive, and we are an agrarian society. We depend a lot on agriculture, and diesel prices were really volatile, and that's where we saw this adoption, really massively. So, these are some of the developments that we have seen in Pakistan, and the lesson that we have learned is when the grid fails to provide a reliable and affordable electricity, people can drive energy transition faster than any policy mandate.
So that's really this idea that if the system isn't working within the country, renewables is a way to get around the problem. But one of the challenges that comes with that is I've heard that a lot of the solar that is being deployed obviously comes from the global north. So what can we do about trying to encourage local manufacturing and development? I mean, do you have any thoughts on policies that would support that? And I would open that up to the panel as well, because I think it's worth sharing.
Yeah, luckily for us, we are fortunately, we are fortunate to be in the neighborhood of China, and 99% of the panels that we were having that are being installed in the country come from China. But that does not mean that we should not start thinking about local manufacturing, because in this rapidly evolving world, China is becoming the powerhouse of clean technologies, and it should now assume a role of thinking beyond just being a supplier of these technologies, and it should somehow try to complement that position by making investments, transferring that technology, diversifying supply chains, and I think Pakistan is at the right place to take such an initiative forward. But the problem with us in the country is, we've been struggling to announce any policy. I mean, I will somehow contradict myself here because, for installations, we didn't need any policy. There was some kind of support from the government, but that was not, unique. It was standard kind of facilitation that we see in many countries, such as zero-rated imports of panels, and then a good net metering policy. But when it comes to local manufacturing, you have to provide some kind of fiscal and financial incentives to the local industry. And we've been struggling to come up with a policy framework. Though, when it comes to job creation, solar business has been really lucrative, and that's why we have seen this rapid adoption in the country. Some of our EPC companies are now competing with the Western companies in the Middle East. Almost all the installers are, from the local population. Almost every electrician has now become a solar installer, because the promise of solar is it's modular, it's easy to install, and the resource is virtually available everywhere in the country, and it has created a lot of jobs. But we have to move beyond this import mindset and start producing our panels locally to create more value in the country.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the topics that has been throughout this week. I mean, Jakob, based on your work in energy and development, for those countries that aren't lucky enough to be very close to China and access to cheap solar and have a grid that basically people want to get past, what do they do?
I think China's reach is far and beyond its region. Of course, I mean the region that I'm quite busy at is mainly Africa and to some extent South Asia. And I think China's presence, or at least the supply of renewable energy, is quite universal, I would say, and to some extent the data that was shown earlier kind of demonstrate that. But I think that the part of the challenge is, of course, in Africa you have countries that are producing some of the critical minerals. The question is, what can they do with that? How can they upgrade? How can they move towards, higher up the ladder towards manufacturing and so forth? That's the conversation that we're in at the moment. And of course, a single country in Africa would not be in a position to do that. But there are some interesting examples, such as Indonesia, that has managed to move up the battery ladder by controlling its nickel production and export, and has managed to build a fairly robust industrial base within its borders, and is one of becoming a major exporter. Of course, behind it is also investment from China and elsewhere. One thing, of course, we shouldn't neglect is that this comes with a cost. Of course, the benefits are that it creates jobs, it creates opportunities, but there are also environmental challenges there that one has to think about, which means then that the policy domain or the policy conversation also kicks into other sectors to make sure that that justice is not just restricted at the consumption point, but also across the production line as well.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, you're absolutely right, and there are trade-offs that have to be addressed at every level. But it's one thing to be able to take action and change the relationship if you have the power to change the trading relationships, but how do you go about building up networks of innovation locally?
I think, the first thing is that you have to start building the capability you have within your national borders, but also beyond. But also recognize what has happened to capacity that was built already in the past, and the types of international policies or structural adjustment program, the way in which it came and actually decimated some of the early capacity that was built across Africa. So you have to kind of work within that kind of historical legacy of innovation being strangled by international policy. But the key is, of course, without building local innovation, you cannot have this conversation about moving up the ladder and so forth. So all of that has to come hand in hand. What it means is that countries need to invest in a robust way, building their national innovation institutions. And here I'm largely talking about Africa. Of course, I think when we go to Latin America and elsewhere, you may see a very different picture altogether. And what that means is allocating resources for that, because at the moment, quite a lot of institutions are dependent on northern funding. And I think that is the kind of change that we need to see, that governments actually take seriously their knowledge institutions and actually invest in them so that they have better control of them, but also create the type of workforce and expertise and analysts for the future.
Okay, Pedro, you wanted to come in on this.
Yes, I think I could not agree more with Jacob on this, and I would like to bring in a very interesting concept from innovation economics, which is the distinction between passive technological learning and active technological learning. So in both, you're actually at the beginning of building up your innovation ecosystem, dependent on foreign technology. But in the first, you basically do nothing. You acquire off-the-shelf technology. You may create some jobs for installing those technologies and maintaining them, but no value addition beyond that. If you are, on the contrary, taking an active role in creating national institutions that will be able to create knowledge and capacity to absorb this technology and later on, in a later stage, be able to adapt this technology and to create innovations beyond these technologies, I think then you are able to really harness, let's say, the potential of technology transfer and really gain value addition in your economy. We have some examples in Brazil, for example, the aviation sector, which today is, let's say, Brazil is one of the 5 countries in the world who is able to provide civil aircrafts. And that all started with, in the 40s with technology transfer. But before that, we created our aeronautical university. We created a national company that was able to really enshrine those technologies acquired, and then later on we were able to build our own aircrafts and develop them. So I think that distinction is very important, and although it's difficult for developing countries to initiate that process, I think some sacrifice needs to be done in order to start this, local capability building. Yeah.
So we're very much talking about education, skilling up, that sort of thing. Beatrice, can I turn to you? I'm really interested in the European perspective on this. How do you think Europe can support local innovation and structural change in Africa, for example, which is obviously extremely underfunded? And, we are actually seeing a growth in the disconnect between the amount of money going in different areas.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this question and for inviting me to this debate. I must say, majority of my work focuses on the European context. I come from the European Commission, where we deal with energy, research, innovation policies in Europe, but also in the international cooperation context. But looking, let's say, at this debate and the conclusions of the week, it seems to me that many challenges that are at European level, they are broadened up at international level. When we talk about skills, when we talk about financing, when we talk about development of value chain, when we talk about local solutions, when we talk about synergies between agriculture and PV or water, the nexus water, energy, and so on, they are all there. When we talk about energy poverty, all of this, they are, let's say, problems and issues, not only, let's say, in international context, but at local context, at European context. So this week, this debate shows that there is still a lot of mutual learning that must happen, because problems are really global at a global scale, and let's say, and issues to advance on clean energy transition. Now, what is Europe doing, to your question? And sorry for this, but I really wanted to bring a bit this positive energy that is coming through this conference, and the useful, let's say, discussions and learning. What is Europe doing to help let's say, to support structural transformation and localized innovation in Africa, or what we call the Global South? You said that there is, let's say, who said that, let's say, this conference, this debate is about a lot of contradiction, and so let me also bring, let's say, a number of dimensions which might be maybe a bit, disconnected, but where we believe, let's say, both working at international, global level, but also working really at local level help with that. So first of all, we believe that in order to achieve localized innovation, we, at least as European Commission, we first want to tackle that at the global cooperation level. So we believe that we are a proud partner in Mission Innovation, which is a multilateral platform, voluntary, uniting the world's largest public funders on clean energy innovation. And we lead there with a number of countries, a number of challenges or mission challenges. I like to mention, for example, the Clean Hydrogen Mission, where we co-lead, for example, also with Chile among the, let's say, global South countries. And there we support, for example, the hydrogen valleys, which are creation of hydrogen local ecosystems from production to end use. And the experience that we do in Europe, we want to share and to emerge with other local initiatives in other mission innovation countries and share this knowledge and see how, let's say, each valley in Europe has its own local ecosystem, so to say. So this is also, it has to be seen in the local, let's say, local context. In Africa, for example, I want to mention, and this is something very localized, very tailored partnership. Of course, we have a big initiative in the context of the Africa-EU innovation agenda, where, let's say, it is at institutional level, where, of course, clean energy is a priority. And there I'd really like to mention this project that I brought brochures. So we have a lot of projects supporting cooperation EU-Africa. And in particular, I like to mention this one. And I want also to recall this principle about decolonize and creating and co-creating technologies. Because, for example, this project that we have, LEAP-RE, which was supported in the last framework program and now continuing under LEAP-C, is a co-funded project by the European Commission, by European member states, and by African countries. So we all work together for let's say, for solutions for Africa, but let's say they are co-created all together. And they are not only on knowledge creation, like, for example, it was a co-development of the Atlas in Africa for geothermal resources. So it's knowledge creation, but it's also creation of products, of, like, for example, on cooking, of power generation, very tailored solution. So technology co-creation, I think this was mentioned before. We believe that this is really a tool where we have to work on an equal basis, and it can help. I mean, this is not only in Africa, in the context of bilateral cooperation with India, that it's of course different part of the world, different setting. In the context of Trade and Technology Council, we are working with India. We are co-creating innovation in the context, for example, of waste to hydrogen technologies. So we have launched recently a call for projects where we want European consortium and Indian consortia to work together to create a waste to hydrogen project. And similarly, we are doing this for, we will launch it very soon, recycling of batteries. So Europe and India, let's say, research and industry developing together technology. So this is, I think, also a way where we believe, let's say, can be a way forward to go.
Okay, so I really like this idea of co-creation, but if we're talking about the challenges that exist structurally in moving things forward, then perhaps we sort of need to turn our thoughts towards climate finance and how that aligns with national priorities, because Jakob, you talked about the importance of having, national plans and integrated planning, and this is terribly, terribly important. Pedro, can I ask you, with Brazil hosting COP30, how do you think it can actually help shift global finance and industry to actually better support and not do things in the traditional way, maybe move away from risk mitigation?
Yes, we are in a very, very special moment, I would say, in the Brazilian government and Brazilian Foreign Service, because we are experiencing a period of 3 years in which we are occupying in a sequential manner the presidencies of many fora. So it started 2023 with IPSA, last year with the G20 and the Mercosur, and this year, right now, with BRICS and, as you said, COP30, end of the year. And this gives us a unique opportunity to maybe influence a bit more the discussion and the debate on the global level on various topics. But what we assured to be consistent throughout these years of presidencies is that we need structural change. And if we want to move to a real transition to a low carbon economy, it cannot happen if we don't change the, let's say, prevailing structures of the world economic order as it is now. So a radical shift needs to take place, and that's we have been, let's say, on various segments we have been proposing. These, let's say, shift, of course, entails also the financial sector, because as of today, what we have is that basically those capital costs more for those who have less, and capital costs less for those who have more. Basically, that's the situation that we have now. And how do we change that? So we tried specifically with regards to, attracting and making financial flows, tackle climate change, the challenges of climate change, especially in developing countries. We've tried to come forward with some possible solutions during our G20 presidency, specifically our task force on the mobilization against climate change. So one of the problems developing countries face, for example, is the volatility of its currency. So, that, I think, prevents investors to come in and really invest because, the rate can be, X in one month and 2-3x in 3 months later. So how do we tackle that? So we came forward with a partnership actually to showcase that a possible solution, a solution is possible. Partnership with a regional development bank, IDB, in order to try to mitigate the risk volatility by having this multilateral development bank. It's a regional bank, really coming forward with capital in order to make sure that the rate that was applicable at the date of the investment remains the same for the investor. So that's one let's say, solution we came forward.
So is that a bit like just leveling the playing field?
Yeah, exactly. So we have it's the same or similar conditions, let's put it this way. Another instrument we also, suggested within the task force is the instrument of country platforms, which is basically a mechanism in order to combine national needs with technological capabilities, so technological providers with financial providers. So, and that in the context of national development plans. Because what we wanted to go away from that prevailing narrative or prevailing approach that was always project-based, and we have a investment in renewable energies or any types of projects to tackle climate change that would consider the overall strategic economic planning. And that through country platforms, I think that is a useful mechanism. And that's also something we try to put forward. Of course, these are, let's say, instruments. They maybe on the short term don't really imply structural shifts, but I think it's a beginning. And I think, as so far our experience in Brazil has been very positive.
One of the things that hasn't come up, and I do think is important and has been raised over the last few days, is this issue of local narratives. And when I say that, I don't mean national narratives. I mean really local narratives. Because you have a situation where there is the imbalance of power between the global north and the MDAS, but there's also an imbalance of power within countries. So it's often, it's the people with money who get access to the new technologies. How important do you think it is to include really local narratives. And to be honest, I just gave a very short definition of what that is. What does it actually mean? Does anyone want to take that?
Well, I can maybe start. Yeah, I think maybe what you're saying is that maybe also transitioning to a bottom-up approach rather than, top-down approaches. And I think that take into consideration the various local realities you have within one country. I mean, I can again tell about my country, which we always say that multiple countries within one. If you take the situation of the northern part of Brazil, in Belém, where the COP is going to be held, is totally different, economic-wise, socially-wise, from the reality of São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro or even Brasilia, our capital. So I think that is important lessons we are learning towards, the preparation of the COP, is how to take into consideration the local reality, and that entails also, trying to build channels of meaningful and effective conversations with local communities that have been on the margins of, political decision making for all the history. I mean, it's, for example, indigenous people in Brazil, or local Afro-descendant communities. It's not easy. It's, let's say, a evolving process, because the system of knowledge is different as well in many cases. No? We have in our, let's say, industrialized cities, let's say maybe a rationality, a prevailing rationality that differs totally from the ones of those local communities. But I think we are getting there. We are, in this COP in Belém, we will have a significant participation of indigenous people. We are discussing, for example, how indigenous knowledge can influence evidence making in terms of climate knowledge, for example, and how to learn from their techniques in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So I think maybe this COP will be, let's say, one important laboratory in how to build this very diverse and new channels for conversations with those local communities.
So when we're talking about new channels, new ways of looking at things, the idea that we have a system that needs to be changed, do we need a new narrative for what we actually mean by the energy transition? How important do you think it is to change the story we're trying to tell? Because we seem to have two very opposing views, one of which is the problems are structural and everything needs to change, and one that is the problems are structural, we recognize that, but we need to do things piecemeal. So what do you actually think about changing the narrative? Anyone? Pedro?
Can I bring in the climate finance into the changing the narrative? Because this is very important, because in the structures that we described earlier, there's a lot of false solutions and dangerous distractions that tend to reproduce the same structures, and therefore the narrative about those false solutions is important. So when it comes to climate finance, and as somebody who 5 years ago was completely outside of the climate space, and so I come in as an alien observing what's happening here and what the narrative is, and it was really a shock to me when I learned about how things are being discussed in the climate space. So when you look at the root cause of the problem, which is emissions, like since the Industrial Revolution, and you look at the concept of a carbon budget and which countries have been responsible for the cumulative emissions, you realize that there's countries that have exceeded their carbon budget and countries, especially the African continent, that only emitted 4% of global emissions. So the countries that exceeded their carbon budget owe a climate debt. And the concept of debt in economics and finance and law is very straightforward. So Jakob, if I owe you $100, I'm supposed to pay you $100, right? And we can sit down and negotiate a payment plan as friends and everything. But at the end of the day, I give you $100 and you don't have to give me anything. But instead, in the climate finance space, instead of me giving you $100, I give you $3 and I tell you exactly what to do with it on my conditions, right? And you have to follow my conditionalities. And then I feel bad for you because you clearly need more than that. So I'm going to lend you $7, right? With concessional loans, you know, noblesse oblige. And I tell you exactly what to do with it and get you into a debt trap. And then, of course, you need more than that because we're in a climate crisis. So more climate finance. So I'm going to give you $10, but you have to give me your forest to offset my emissions so I can continue the emissions. And you now have to protect the forest because it's carbon market territory. So you have to protect it from its own custodians, the native communities that have preserved the forest, right? So, and then I give you $20 to produce green hydrogen for me, not for you, right? And I invest another $20 in your green industrial zone to assemble stuff from me, not for you, right? And at the end of the day, Jakob is looking at me and saying, wait a minute, where's my $100? Why am I giving you my forest? Why are you taking my hydrogen? You see what I mean? So shifting the narrative, sometimes you just have to look at the whole thing and say, climate finance should be repackaged as a conversation, as a narrative, into what it should be, which is debt cancellation, not debt rescheduling. That's number one, in terms of getting out of the debt, to create the fiscal policy space that we need for scaling up renewables, transfer of technologies, life-saving technologies to unleash the potential that we've been talking about in terms of renewables, clean cooking, clean transportation, and it should be in the form of grants, not loans, and economic entrapment. And it should be at scale. I mean, the scale of the problem versus the numbers that we're seeing in the COP negotiations, most of which is loans and, you know, carbon markets and, you know, if we're serious about the problem, we need radical solutions, not in the political sense. Radical as in going to the roots of the problem, that's what the term means literally. And if we don't have radical solutions that go to the roots, then we end up with superficial solutions that reproduce the status quo. So the narrative about what we're doing is extremely important because it tells us if we're going into distractions and perpetuation of the status quo, or if we're really aiming at the transformation that the urgency of the situation calls for.
Zishan, I saw you wanted to jump in.
So, you know, within this energy transition narratives, the Pakistani case of the solar boom apparently might look quite promising, but what we are seeing at the same time is people who needed it the most are being left behind, and you know they are slipping through the cracks because you know they are affluent class was the first to install solar panels, and SMEs, you know, people who are unable to afford these installations are being left behind, and even people who are connected to the national grid but are unable to install solar panels, the cost for electricity is becoming more and more for them because they have to pay for the contracts that have been signed by the government for next 20-25 years. So, you know, that's where we kind of need, you know, some kind of additional support in a manner where private sector dynamism can be combined or complemented with some form of philanthropic capital or multilateral development support so that, you know, this transition becomes inclusive and participatory and no one is left behind.
Okay, now we talked about the need for a shift in perspective. I can't read the screen from this angle, so I'm going to shift my perspective and come over here just to have a quick look at some of the audience's questions. I think there's a really interesting one here on if we actually highlighted the win-win approach, the benefits for the... I can't even read it. Here we go. On the win-win approach, the benefits for the Global South were highlighted, but which would be the win that convinces the North for changing the hierarchy? That is really interesting, and that's really what I was getting at the beginning of my conversation. How do we change that narrative? Because we're operating with a system that... Go for it.
Yeah. I'll try. I mean, I suppose we have to ask the question, which part of the global north are we talking about? Because at the moment, the global north itself is within countries and across countries is a divided entity. Yeah. And there is a reason for that. I think, you know, part of it is why people are voting this way or the other way, call it, you know, along the extremes in politics, is to an extent, you know, they have equal or similar grievances as those in the global south. So within the global north, you have a global south as well. So even as, you know, countries are pushing, you know, Germany, Spain, and so forth, on renewables, there are people who are actually raising their voices about extractivism. Yeah. And that tends to be converted into a toxic form of politics. So the real question is how the global north is going to, you know, create a narrative that makes sense for the global north, you know, in a way that it holds people together and in moving forward. So it's a divided force that we are looking at. So the question is, what types of policies, what types of interventions, what type of concessions need to be made within the global north, not so much between global north and south. I think that's you know, it may be a different kind of boundary, if you want to call it, but the boundary that really matters is how do you save the global north from itself?
I think that speaks very well to one of the other questions, which is fascinating, which is how much does the neoclassical economic narrative contribute to the structural imbalance between the north and south? Well, you kind of explained that. It's not the north and south, it's the rich and the poor. Doesn't matter where you are, that is a structural problem. There is a question about gaps in data and software tools, so the public availability. How much do you think, where do you think the gaps are? Do you think we could make a change that would help accelerate the transfer of tech? What do we want to see with software and tools? Do we want to bring AI and make everything open source? Would anyone like to respond to that? I mean, it's not the topic of today's conversation. I was just really interested in the question. No, that's unfair. Unless, Jakob, you'd like to?
I mean, I think, you know, I'm not sure about AI. Of course, I mean, you know, the issue about AI, in my view, is that, you know, it's not so much, you know, the problem is AI, but rather the way in which, you know, AI is being rolled out. The amount of energy, the speed, and the kind of, you know, very complex programs that, but there are those within the AI community that argue that there are ways that you can do it in a way that it is accountable and it's people-centered and so forth. So there are different ways of doing it. Now, in terms of, you know, knowledge, rather data and analytical tools and so forth, I mean, one of the things that some colleagues in our program are doing is keeping tools as open as possible, making sure that you know, what's in those models, for instance, is completely transparent, so that people, you know, researchers are able to go and use it. But as much as possible also to try to make sure that a lot of the models that are constructed are co-created, but they are actually constructed by Southern researchers themselves, with, of course, you know, support and collaborations with the Global North institutions. Just to indicate, I mean, this is an issue that we are beginning to pick up. Fadel, myself, and other colleagues, we are setting up an institute on African Institute of Energy Systems and Systems Analysis, precisely to be able to domesticate and be able to control the knowledge system within Africa by African, you know, young African researchers within Africa.
And by the way, we also look forward to institutions like IRENA on creating this data for for policymakers, for the public, to inform about the situation. I mean, this debate today, it has shown. We are looking forward to the regional outlook for Africa, for example. So all of this work is extremely valuable in terms of data creation and use for policymakers, for everybody, to take also informative decision and show really what is the reality on the ground.
Just very quickly on that topic, I think normally when we refer to AI, we normally take this metaphor of the double-edged sword in terms of that it is, it comes in with lots of opportunities, but also with lots of risks and threats. If you apply this to the climate, the climate change, I think there's lots of areas, energy, for example, forest, also transportation, where AI can be very useful in order to mitigate emissions. But on the other way around, AI has, increasing investments in AI can also come with more energy consumption and, emissions as well, and so on. But when it comes to, the economics of AI, I think here also we can apply this double-edged sword because, of course, it can bring in economic value addition. But in a way it has been, rolling out so far, what we've seen is a concentration of, development power of AI in a few countries, in a few companies, right? So I think that's what we need to break. And I think there was like 2 months ago, a very interesting report by UNCTAD on, how the developing world can leverage AI. And there's basically 3 levels here. It's data, it's skills, and it's infrastructure. There is an enormous gap in all 3 of those levels. But I think by identifying them, at least we can start trying to, maybe challenge this big gap that exists, and try to really reduce this difference between the North and South. Yeah.
And this is just a really interesting thing that I've picked up over the last few days, that whatever we try and talk about changing, it interrelates to about 16 other different things that all have to change at the same time, which does make it a bit of a struggle. Now, I apologize for walking away from the audience questions, but I've been strict with everybody on time, and I think I'm closely running it. I can't see that, it's too far away. 5, brilliant. Then could I just perhaps ask a final question of everybody? We're coming up to COP30. We want to see change. What is one key shift that you think would make a difference? Now, that could be a narrative shift. It could be a structural shift. It might be some huge breakthrough at the COP. But what do you think is the one thing we need to change, or that is most needed to drive innovation for a fair and just and sustainable future?
Well, I've been joking around with some of my friends that we shouldn't send hundreds of negotiators and civil society groups to Brazil. It's just too expensive and such a waste of time. We should just send maybe a handful of people with just a very simple piece of paper that has the following kind of demands, kind of slide the piece of paper across the table, kind of in a very, with music background and everything, say, these are our demands for climate action. Take it or leave it. Very simple, kind of shifting the narrative. Transfer of technology for real industrial policies to unleash the potential for real climate action, that is replicating an entire value chain of manufacturing solar, wind, geothermal, clean cooking, clean transportation at scale. Why? Because the Global South as a bloc, not as national industrial policies, has the complementarity of resources and capabilities, the economies of scale for real industrial policy, the youngest labor force on the planet. What is lacking is the actual manufacturing technology to do that leapfrogging that is needed. So that's one. And that doesn't...
I said one.
That's one. Okay, there's the rest of the list, but you can picture what's coming next.
I think everybody can come and ask you for the rest of the picture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have to keep you on time. Jakob, what's yours?
Well, to continue what you... one thing to say here really is also I'm glad that the COP is actually happening in Brazil. It's high time that we have a COP where it actually is happening in a place where some progressive agenda can actually be advanced. So that's what was your second point, was it? No. But But my call here really is for Brazil to play its weight, because Brazil is going to be under enormous pressure to go this way or that way, but to really be a host, not only for its own, for hosting the event and looking good, but really to really host this in a way that it actually picks up on some of those key Global South agenda and making sure that it gets pushed forward. So we're hopeful.
Beatrice.
Yes, I think I want to build on what was said earlier, that in terms of technology transfer and really have this change of philosophical approach, that we're really talking of co-creation, technology co-creation to strengthen innovation systems. So it's not only, so it really, working on an equal basis. And this narrative is probably what, if shifting this narrative in the depth, is probably what will make the difference or will contribute to that.
Great. Pedro.
Maybe I should hear my colleague first, and then I can try to...
Well, I'll circle back to what I said earlier. We should start believing in people instead of providing them with policy prescriptions and imposing bureaucratic decisions on them. We should trust their choice and let them do things on their own. We have the technologies available. We just need to know how to use them. And, there are no better, species than human beings who can use that.
Great.
Yeah.
Pedro. The final word.
Yeah, you asked for a shift, and I mean, after hearing all my colleagues here in the panel, I think I mean we can see that many shifts need to happen. But one thing that we as a presidency have been trying to convey into the world, that one of the shifts that is quite important to happen is the shift in mindset, and that's why we have let's say, put this concept, ancestral concept of mutirão, which is a local indigenous concept of collective effort, everybody coming together to achieve a common goal. And I think that needs to be, I mean, that mindset needs to come back again. I mean, it was there maybe for some time, but now we live in a very polarized moment, lots of contentions happening everywhere, and maybe we need to go back to the spirit of collective effort, everybody towards the same goal, and that's maybe that spirit, that shift we want to make it happen in Belém later this year.
I think that's the perfect note. That's the perfect note. Is that working? Yes. That's the perfect note I was trying to say on which to end, because I think that's exactly what we've seen the last few days here, is actually people trying to work together towards a common goal. So could you join me in thanking our panelists this afternoon? I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank the chair as well.
Oh, well, thank you very much. We're going to move on. I think this is the perfect time for it, to the youth speech. So I'm going to invite... sorry, I'm tripping over. I want to invite Ana Ramez-Tovar, who is part of the IRENA youth delegation, to come up to the stage. And I will ask my colleagues to step down from the stage.
Yes, sorry.
Hello? It's working. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to be with everyone here today at IRENA's Innovation Week, a space that brings together compromised people shaping the energy system of the future. Thanks, IRENA, to being open to young participation also. Let me begin with this. The energy transition, it is not merely technical. It is deeply human. It is not just about replacing fuels or increasing megawatts. It is a change in the very paradigm of the energy, a shift in power, in participation, opportunities, and a purpose. If we're not careful, we risk designing a transition that simply enrich the same percentage, the same small percentage on the global population, locks future generation into the new dependencies, and misses out on the transformative potential of renewables to build a more just and inclusive societies. We are standing in a crossroad, and we have a choice to replicate old models or to embrace the energy transition as a project of social transformation. And this is also innovation. I speak today not only on behalf of future generations, but also on behalf of those whose voices have been marginalized for too long. Young people, women, especially young women, ethnic communities, and local farmers. Those who often live closest to the consequence of the climate change, yet are farthest from the decision-making spaces. In my work, particularly with Bloomberg and across diverse communities in Colombia, we have seen that sustainable energy can make possible lighting up schools, powering rural clinics, enable women and youth to lead projects, and creating economic alternatives that are deeply rooted in place. But these benefits only come when communities are not passive recipients, but an active co-creators of the energy system. We are already doing this, I mixed it. Truly escape and sustain this impact, we must go a step further. What if all actors, including the private sector, are systematically integrated, not just an economic player, but an active partner contributing to broader goals of society by creating an environment that fosters collaboration, shared responsibility, and the exchange of knowledge? To build that, we must overcome structural barriers. That means investing not only in infrastructure, but in education and bidirectional knowledge transfer. Territories don't just need imported solutions. They need the education of their own people, because they know the social and environmental dynamics better than anyone. With their ancestral knowledge, their right skills and tools, they can propose solutions that are both social, innovative, and locally appropriate. We also need to move beyond the paternalistic approaches. My father used to teach me, no te voy a dar el pescado, te voy a enseñar a pescar. I will not give you the fish, but teach you how to fish. But let's be honest, there are difficult conversations we must have. We are facing a political challenge. Many countries are deprioritizing the energy transition and climate action. This is a moment for us to grow together as leaders, because we want to, we can, and we must lead the energy transition. This is a call to strengthen economic instruments and carbon dioxide mitigation markets without falling into a subsidized driving models. The transition cannot be paternalistic or extractive. It must be collaborative and built from the ground up. That starts by recognizing that different communities may have different visions of development. There is no one-size-fits-all model, and that's the beauty and the challenge of the just energy transition. It demands that we listen deeply and design systems that reflect the plurality of our world. A just transition needs to include the workers, families, and entire communities who have relied for generations fossil-based economies. We cannot stigmatize them. They have powered our societies for decades. We must now offer them a reliable and attractive path forward through reskilling, reinvestment, and new roles in the renewable economy. That is not just a matter of fairness, it is a matter of social justice. We are already doing this work. We're deeply trying it. At Bloomberg, we are building partnerships with communities to co-create energy solutions that reflect their knowledge, their goals, and their culture. It is not easy. It takes time, trust, and willingness to let go of traditional top-down models. But the results are more durable, equitable, and innovative than anything we could design in isolation. Also, through alliance with companies, chambers of industry and commerce, as well as other economic, governmental, and civil society organizations. Why does this matter as a global level? Because this transition, it is not just intersectoral. It must be interdisciplinary, intergenerational, and territorial. And that means changing the way we make decisions. We must now promote new governance practice rooted in cooperation. Climate change is transnational and transgenerational, and energy sits on its earth. We cannot solve it in silos. We must build across disciplines, cultures, and generations. Let's be clear. A just transition is not fossil replace, it is regenerative. It does not just decarbonize, it decentralizes and dignifies. It cannot be built for communities. It must be built with them. We've started and the results are real, but now we need to scale cooperation and a new energy story. So let's think big, act together, and lead with purpose. Let's make this transition not just fair in words, but fair in actions. Thank you. Let's build it together.
Thank you, Anna. That was inspirational and very much appreciated. For our closing remarks, could I invite Gary Singh, Deputy Director of IRENA, to the stage, who will be closing today's event.
Good afternoon. It's really not often that you have to come up with closing remarks to a full room, so which is, a reflection on how engaged and how incredibly participative this whole 3 days has been. And I want to thank all of you for making it so participative and so coming in, to give us your insights and be able to enrich and energize these last 3 days. I also think it was, partly also because of this really hard-hitting discussion we had, and then this amazing and inspiring presentation that we heard from Anna Maria. I was just sitting and thinking about how different it was just 2 years back for the last Innovation Week that we had. Very different mood. We'd just come away from this kind of a political commitment on net zero. And there was this buoyancy, there was this energy that you could feel when we were making these discussions. And, in this year, today, when we are sitting and having these discussions in this edition of the Innovation Week, we have clearly seen cracks developing in that kind of global commitment that was made. We also see that, the kind of headwinds, the geopolitical tensions that are leading to governments reordering their priorities on how they want to spend their public finance. And, it gives you that kind of a pessimism, but I think the kind of momentum that the renewable energy is now seeing because of the declining cost, because of increased efficiencies, because of the socio-economic benefits that are coming through, but more importantly, because of a very large community that has come together of practitioners, of policymakers, of innovators, of technology providers who are really creating that momentum because of the strong business case also, and pushing it through this kind of I would say like a pessimistic narrative strands that are emerging also in the way we see things happening. So I just want to say here that when we look back on this particular period, maybe 10 years back, then we probably say to ourselves that, well, no one really said that energy transition or any transition is going to be easy, because no transition is. And this particular period was just a small blip in the upward and the growth in the kind of trajectory that we want to see as we move towards the new energy systems. So I just want to thank all of you, all our partners, for being here with us, and to my colleagues who have really worked very long hours, have spent months curating this very powerful, relevant agenda, which has kept us so engaged. And also, just to say that you really brought in some amazing speakers who have ignited or energized us as we come to a close of this Innovation Week. So thank you all, and have safe travels back.
Can we have a picture on the closing session, all panelists together and the speakers? And then a picture of Arina.